All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to get into it.
Great. Today, we're going to be looking at George Lamar Jones.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating case, a serial killer.
Yeah, really complex case,
Yeah.
made even more, I don't know, interesting, I guess,
Right.
by the fact that, some of his crimes happened in Milwaukee
Milwaukee, yeah.
at the same time as another serial killer, Walter E. Ellis.
Wow, that's a crazy coincidence.
Yeah, makes you wonder, right? Like, what are the
Well,
chances?
exactly.
So you sent over a Wikipedia article about Jones, his life and crimes, and
Yeah.
that's going to be our jumping off point. So
Sounds good.
what really struck you about this case when you were first reading about it?
Well, I think what really got me was how his first murder conviction back in 72 might have actually shaped his later crimes.
Oh, interesting. You're talking about the manslaughter conviction in Mississippi.
Exactly. Yeah, for the death of Corrine Jones.
Right, and I think that's what makes this case so intriguing right from the start. He was indicted for murder initially, but
Yeah, but
his lawyer successfully argued that
that is epilepsy.
his epilepsy played a role,
Yeah.
and he ended up serving a much shorter sentence, just 5 years.
It's a fascinating legal defense, right?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, though, like, what's your take on using epilepsy as a defense in court? And could that have influenced his later actions?
Well, I mean, it's a really complex issue. Epilepsy, it can, in some rare cases, lead to those violent outbursts, sometimes called epileptic rage.
Right, right.
But it's a pretty controversial defense.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it really makes you think, was his legal team just using a real medical condition to get a lighter sentence?
Right.
Or did this victory, like, embolden him in some way, make him think he could use his epilepsy to avoid consequences later on?
It's chilling to think about, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, and after he was released, he moved to Milwaukee. And from what I read, it seems like his life just kind of spiraled downwards from there.
Yeah, you see the drug addiction, he's got run-ins with the law, and then eventually it escalates into something much darker.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when, those patterns start to emerge. He's working as a handyman,
Yeah, Handyman.
associating with prostitutes,
Yeah.
which, becomes pretty significant when we think about the victims in his later crimes.
It's like a foreshadowing, almost.
Yeah, exactly. And think about the context here, right? Milwaukee at that time, already dealing with its own serial killer problem.
With Walter Ellis, yeah.
Right. It's just mind-blowing that there were two serial killers active in the same city at the same time.
It's statistically very rare.
Yeah. It makes you think, like, how did they stay under the radar for so long?
Well, that's the thing about serial killers, right? They can blend in so easily.
Yeah, they can. And it begs the question, did their paths ever cross? Did the police, even suspect Jones in any of Ellis's crimes?
Or vice versa.
It's definitely a possibility. We may never know for sure.
Yeah. And then in 1997, you have the murder of Shamika Carter.
Oh, right, a prostitute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they found her body dumped on a pile of garbage.
The horrific discovery.
Absolutely. And this case is ultimately what led to Jones's capture.
And what's interesting is the police, they didn't reveal his identity right away after the arrest.
Right.
They were obviously trying to see if he was connected to other unsolved murders, especially of young women.
Yeah. There was a lot of speculation at the time, and just days before Carter's murder, he had assaulted two other women.
Really?
Yeah, just days after being released from prison. It's like you can see this clear escalation in his behavior.
Like a growing sense of boldness, maybe even a feeling of being untouchable.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you read his confession to Carter's murder, it's just disturbing.
He claims he met her to buy drugs, and she mocked his sexual performance, and that sent him into this rage that led to her strangulation.
Powerful stuff. Makes you wonder, though, is that really what happened?
Yeah, is that a legitimate motive? Or is he trying to manipulate the story, portray himself as the victim?
It's hard to say for sure. I mean, the brutality of the crime, the pattern of escalation we've seen, it just points to something much deeper.
Absolutely. And to make things even more complicated, his lawyer tried to use the insanity plea again.
Really? Just like in Mississippi.
Yeah, citing his epilepsy.
Wow.
And what's really interesting? One of the psychiatrists who evaluated Jones, his name was George Palermo.
No way. The same one who examined Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yep, the same guy.
That's a crazy connection.
It is. It's like all these seemingly separate cases are somehow linked. Two serial killers in the same city, and now this connection to Dahmer. It's a lot to process.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And the story doesn't end there. While Jones was awaiting trial for Carter's murder, he was investigated for the murders of 3 other women: Vernell Jeter in 1990, Joyce Mims in 1992, and Mary Lee Harris in 1993.
Okay, so 4 potential victims now.
Yeah. And what's strange is Jones admitted to having sexual encounters with Jeter and Mims, but he denied killing them.
He claims he didn't do it.
Yeah, and he denied even knowing Harris. But her body was found near his residence.
So he admits to some details, but not the murders themselves.
Exactly. Could this be a strategy? Admitting to lesser offenses to seem cooperative while deflecting blame for the bigger crimes?
Possibly, yeah. Maybe he's trying to control the narrative, make himself look less guilty.
Right. And then, almost out of the blue, he decides to plead no contest to Carter's murder.
No contest.
Yeah, he said he wanted to get it over with. What do you make of that?
Well, on the surface, it seems like he's admitting guilt, accepting responsibility. But pleading no contest can also be a tactic.
Oh, how so?
Well, it lets him avoid a trial, which could be long and damaging.
Ah, I see.
Keeps him out of the spotlight, maybe even helps him get a shorter sentence.
So is this genuine remorse
Mm-hmm.
or a calculated move? Or maybe both?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what's really going on in his mind.
It is, and this is just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the DNA evidence that linked him to Mary Lee Harris's murder, the one he swore he didn't know.
Oh, yeah, that's where things really start to unravel.
They do, and we'll dive into all of that in our next segment.
Yeah, that DNA evidence. Years after he said he didn't know her, it really changes things.
It does. You try to bury the truth, but it always seems to find a way out. The article says he eventually confessed, to meeting Harris for drugs. They got into a fight, and he ended up choking her. Another fit of rage. But coming after his denial, it makes his character even harder to figure out.
It really does. Why confess now? Was it, guilt? Trying to make things right before he died? Or was this like one last attempt to control the story? Shape how people saw him even though he was locked up?
It's impossible to know for sure, I guess. But before we go too far, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier. The fact that Jones was active in Milwaukee at the same time as Walter Ellis.
Oh.
2 serial killers. Same city. It's wild.
It's definitely not common, but it does show how serial killers, even though what they do is horrific, they can just blend in.
Right, like they live normal lives right alongside everyone else.
Exactly. Their crimes are hidden, and their victims are often, people who are already marginalized, so it's easier for them to go unnoticed.
And you can't forget the context, right?
Yeah.
Milwaukee in the 80s and 90s, it was facing a lot of problems, social, economic. Maybe that made the city more vulnerable.
Yeah, it's possible. When things are unstable, it can create an environment where predators can take advantage. Victims might be less likely to go to the police, and the police might not have the resources to really investigate.
It's a reminder that these crimes don't happen out of nowhere. They're connected to these bigger issues in society. But I'm still stuck on the fact that Jones and Ellis never seem to cross paths. At least there's no record of it.
It's strange, yeah. But it can happen. Serial killers often have very specific types of victims they look for, and they might have their own areas where they hunt. So even in the same city, they could be in different worlds, basically.
Like 2 ships passing in the night, both leaving a trail of destruction, but in their own separate ways.
Exactly. And that's why these investigations are so tough. Police are putting together tiny bits of information, but they don't have the whole picture.
Like trying to do a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I know we have Jones's epilepsy. Did it play a role in his crimes? It's such a complicated question.
It is. There's no question he had epilepsy. But did it really make him do what he did? That's hard to say. Epilepsy can cause violent outbursts, that's true. But to say that's the only reason for his crimes, that's too simple.
So how do we decide where the line is between someone having a medical condition and being responsible for their actions?
That's the question, isn't it? Lawyers and doctors, they struggle with that all the time. In Jones's case, both in Mississippi and Milwaukee, his epilepsy was part of his defense. But did it really mean he couldn't control himself? We don't know.
It's a gray area. And it makes you wonder, if epilepsy was a factor, were there chances to help him before things got so bad? Could things have been different if he had gotten the right medical care, the right therapy?
It's definitely possible. If you catch epilepsy early and treat it, you can reduce the seizures, and that might mean a lower risk of violence. But even with the best care, you can't predict everything. You can't always prevent it.
Yeah, it's complicated, no easy answers. And it brings us back to the main question here. Who was George Lamar Jones? Was he a manipulator using his epilepsy as an excuse? Was he a deeply troubled person whose actions came from a mix of things, or something else entirely?
We may never know for sure.
We've talked a lot about Jones's mind and how complicated this case is, but it's important to remember the victims, real people who lost their lives. What do you think about the impact of his crimes on their families?
It's huge. They lose loved ones. And they often don't get answers. There's no real closure. It can be incredibly traumatizing.
It's heartbreaking. Are there any resources to help families cope with something like this?
Yeah, there are some organizations. They provide counseling, support, help with the legal system, but it's a long road to recovery.
That's a heavy thought. It reminds us that these aren't just stories, they're real lives.
Mm.
Real people hurt by this violence. It leaves a lot of pain behind.
Yeah, it's a really sad reminder. These crimes, they affect so many people, not just the victims, their families, their communities. It leaves a mark that's hard to erase.
Absolutely. And it's so important to remember that we spend a lot of time talking about the killer, but we can't forget the people whose lives were cut short. Their stories matter. You're right, you're right. Okay, so let's go back to Jones's confession about Mary Lee Harris. Did that lead to any new investigations, into other unsolved cases?
You'd think it would, right? He lied for years, then suddenly confesses because of DNA evidence. It makes you wonder, were there other victims? Maybe the police should have looked at old cases, especially ones with similar victims, to see if there's a connection.
Yeah, it seems logical. I mean, we only know for sure about 2 murders, but he was a suspect in others. Is it hard to reopen those old cases?
Well, there are always hurdles. Evidence gets lost or ruined over time. Witnesses disappear or their memories aren't as clear. And police departments don't always have the money or the people to do it.
That makes sense. It's a tough call, right?
Yeah.
Trying to get justice for potential victims while also using resources wisely.
It is. But technology keeps getting better, DNA and forensics, so there's always a chance that new evidence could pop up and help solve those mysteries.
It's good to know that even after so long, there's still hope for justice. So Jones died in prison in 2012. Natural causes. It's weird to think his story ends in such a normal way after all the darkness and violence.
Right. You'd expect something more, well, dramatic, I guess, for someone who did so much harm.
And get this, there's a strange twist. When he died, at first they thought it was Walter E. Ellis, the other Milwaukee killer. It's like their stories are linked, even in death.
That's just bizarre. Like one last crazy chapter in their shared story of terror. Two guys, totally separate, but both doing these awful things in the same city.
This whole case has been a wild ride, more questions than answers. So, after this deep dive into George Lamar Jones, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I think it really shows us how complicated people can be. It's
Yeah.
hard to wrap your head around why someone would do these things. And it makes you realize how tough it is for the police to solve these crimes, especially when you're dealing with someone who's really good at lying and manipulating people.
And it reminds us that evil can be hiding anywhere, even in places you wouldn't expect, right under our noses.
Exactly. So we have to be careful, be aware of what's going on around us, and we need to support each other, our communities, to try to prevent these things from happening.
This deep dive has been intense, but really fascinating. We've looked into the darkest parts of the human mind, the legal system, and how violence destroys lives and communities.
And we may never fully understand why George Lamar Jones did what he did, but I hope this conversation has helped shed some light on serial killers, how these investigations work, and why it's so important to fight for justice for the victims and their families.
Thanks for being here today and sharing your knowledge. It's been eye-opening, for sure. And to all our listeners, thanks for coming along on this deep dive with us. We encourage you to keep learning about this case and others like it, ask questions, and do what you can to make the world a safer place for everyone.